Okay. So far we've talked about our soul, and I gave you a taxonomy of the soul. Dallas Willard says there are 6 things. I compressed it to 5. Here's what makes us humans. It's not our avatars. It's not the next phase of evolution. It's the fact that God gave us minds. The fact that we have a heart that does choosing, willing. It's the fact that we have a body, a physical body that matters. We have social relationships, and our soul comprises all of these things. Then we talked about how if you read through the scriptures in the New Testament, it's pretty clear that God wants us to develop our souls, to partner with His Holy Spirit, and He intends for us to be fruitful, to grow, to enjoy the spiritual life where there's virtue that comes out of our living. And then I talked about the components to a soul care process, and we just went through the spiritual disciplines so far. That's all we did, and I encourage you to share a little bit about what that looks like in your life. Or take some time to do some notes. So we're going to do something similar now. We're going to work through, we have an hour, we're going to work through 4 more areas that I think are part of a soul care process. Remember, the soul is everything, so this has got to be comprehensive. And this is the beauty. Our whole life can be part of soul care. It's not just what you do with your Bible or while you're praying. Every aspect of your life with the right mindset can be something that cultivates your soul. And the bad news is, everything around us is trying to cultivate our soul in a different way. Willard talks about that in Renovation of the Heart. The world is trying to form us into its image. We want to be conformed to the image of Christ. And so we're going to go on to this next part of it. It's nurturing life-giving relationships. So we're going to think through a couple different categories of relationships, the kind of relationships that God would want for us that would be healthy. I have up here and in your notes, marriage, family, church, friends, mentors, colleagues, mentees. These are kind of in order. But you could make an argument, and I've heard some make the argument that the church actually should be the greatest because Jesus said, hate your father and mother. But I want to go along and say that if you're married, then your marriage has to be the top priority. And the reason I say that is because your marriage is a window into the relationship that Jesus has with the church. And so if you're married, that gets to be the picture of how Christ loves His bride. And I know that one person who's done a lot of great thinking on this is Pete Scazzaro in his book, The Emotionally Healthy Leader. He talks about leading out of your marriage, but also leading out of your singleness. So, sorry I don't have anything up here on singleness, but go to his book and find that section on leading out of your singleness. And he's written some really great details. And the Apostle Paul is a good example. He said, because I'm not married, I'm freed up to pour myself full into ministry. Speaking to married people, though, marriage has to be the priority relationship. So he says here, the first ambition for married Christian leaders must shift from leading our church, organization, or team to loving our spouse passionately. Now here's the problem. Your church can love you after a sermon. Your church can love you after a great outreach event. Your spouse gets to see you in your underpants. Your spouse gets to hear all the noises that you make. Your spouse gets to know the mess that you leave behind. And your spouse gets the opportunity to forgive you 100 times for 100 little things. And you get to see her or him in those same moments and practice, hopefully, forgiveness, forbearance, and all those other things. It's the most intimate relationship, which means there's the greatest chance of volatility or intimacy. And so he gives the encouragement, give your priority focus to your spouse. I found that once we had kids and we made the choice, we don't want to have kids until we've had a couple years of marriage. We got married really young. We were discouraged from doing that because we wouldn't have any money. We still don't, but we're still very happily married. There's not a connection there between wealth and happy marriage. And we decided, though, we wanted to enjoy a couple years of marriage just to build our relationship before we were able to have kids. Now, nobody's promised kids, and sometimes it can take longer, and sometimes, oops, you have kids and you weren't planning on it. So we were blessed. We had a 5-year plan. We made it 4 years into our marriage before the kids came. And children can really wreck your plans for intimacy. They can wreck your plans to have dates. They make things complicated, but they're also a joy and a shared ministry responsibility that you have. But I just know that now that our kids are past the diaper stage, but now they're getting to that like close to teenage age where it's sports and after-school programs. This is the area in life for me where it's easy to drift from my spouse and we become taxi cabs. We're driving them to and fro, and so you have to put important things in place, like bedtimes for your children, like date nights on the calendar. Now, we'll get into some of that later, how your calendar can be your best friend, but your first ambition, it has to start with the heart. You have to choose to make your spouse your priority. And so shifting that, and then he goes on to say, It's our first passion. Then married Christian leaders should be among the most in love couples in the church. It would be an interesting mirror into your ministry to ask, like, some of your friends, so from an outsider's perspective, what do you think about our marriage? Or just think about what people have said about your marriage, because your marriage is a window. You can fake it on Sunday mornings. You can look happy, and if that's the only time people see you, maybe that's an opportunity to invite people into your home and see how you interact with your kids and with your spouse. But maybe he overstates that, but I liked the idea that marriage should be your top priority. If you're a married person, lead out of your marriage. So finding date nights, praying together, walking together, talking together. My wife and I have this thing where we say eye contact. It's really important for us in this day and age where people do a lot of their communication through screens, and we become so addicted to like flashing things that staring at someone's face can be awkward at times. And have you ever had that moment where you look at someone? It could be someone, like it could be your sister, it could be your spouse, it could be one of your kids. You haven't really actually looked at their face for a while, and they look a little different to you. Have you had that moment before? I have that moment occasionally. I'm like, oh, I haven't really been looking at this person. And so my wife and I just like eye contact, because we're not going to talk around the kids. We're going to look at each other and talk. These are the kind of things that are real simple decisions that we make to lead out of our marriage. Laughing together, resting together, serving together, sleeping together. I know as people get older, it's not always it's not always easy to sleep in the same bedrooms, but I found that a lot of older couples end up sleeping in separate beds. I hope that my wife and I don't have to do that. That tends to happen with couples. I found that out. But when you sleep together and go to bed at the same time, it's actually really healthy because you're sharing that experience. It's kind of the last thing you do together. And it keeps you up, not from like being awake, watching something stupid that you shouldn't be watching or wasting a lot of time on the computer that you shouldn't. So go to sleep together. It's just a simple way to build your marriage. One thing that I have to share from his book, because I'm trying to convince my wife to do this, but she's not ready for this yet. He and his wife practice 20 minutes of emotional bonding every day that is naked. So they're just naked 20 minutes a day, walking around the house, doing yoga or something. He doesn't explain exactly what they do, but they're 20 minutes together naked. My wife hasn't joined that yet. But marriage, it's the... Oh, you must have a better marriage. They're so in love. He and his wife are so in love. That's your second wife, second marriage. So that's your central relationship. The next key relationship then is your family. If you do have children in the home, making that a priority to spend quality time with your kids. I don't know how often people nowadays, how often you sit down and have a family meal, but I have heard, anecdotally at least, that having a consistent family meal is one of the healthiest practices that you can have with your family. Even if you just have one meal every day, that's like the link between healthy families that love each other, that don't have divorces, that last a long time, that the kids want to come back home after they've gone out of the house. They sat down and had a meal. We try to have breakfast together every day, and then we have dinner together most nights, once a week in front of the TV, because it's fun. So family would be the second thing, but the danger, at least when your kids are younger, is making them the priority. And kids take a lot of energy, they take a lot of attention and emotion, but again, the key relationship, if you're married with kids, is marriage. Has to be priority. Here's what Vadi Bakum says in his book, Family Shepherds. There are at least 3 reasons that make prioritizing our children over marriage both foolish and dangerous. First, our children will eventually leave home. And if they're the foundation of our family, then their departure will mean our family's demise. How many people do you know, they become empty nesters and then they get a divorce? It's really sad. It's because the kids became the focal point. And it's not hard to do. I totally get it. Kids take time, energy. It's fun to go to their stuff, but the marriage has to be priority. Second, our marriage forms the cornerstone of our children's security. And finally, one of the primary goals is to prepare our children for marriage. And if they see you as a husband and wife not really enjoying each other or prioritizing time together, they're going to grow up with a skewed version of what marriage is supposed to look like. So this would be a thing that I would say, man, we need to pay attention to. I remember when I lived in Phoenix for 2 years. My wife and I were married for probably 2 or 3 years at this point. And we met a younger couple. They had 2 kids. And this couple, all the time in front of their kids, said, I can't wait till you get out of the house. I love you, but I love my spouse so much, and I can't wait to spend more time with her. This is what the husband would say, and the wife would say the same thing. And I remember looking at them saying, can you say that to your kids? You can't tell your kids you want them out of the house. And then I had kids, and it was like the first thing out of my mouth. I can't wait till you're out of the house. I want to be back with my spouse. I think it's healthy for kids to know that you love them, but they're not allowed to stay forever. And I know I'm looking at some of you who have adult children boomeranging back, and that's becoming more of a trend, but they're not allowed to stay there forever. Because marriage is priority. Now you welcome them back for a while and send them back out, because that's preparing them for their marriage. So marriage is the first priority, cultivating a healthy marriage. And some of the stuff we'll talk about next will go along with that. Family life, it's the most intimate place of belonging, and it's a window into our character. This is why when the Apostle Paul says, if you're going to be an elder, you need to have your family under control. You need to be the husband of one wife. Your family is a window into your character. They know you best. You can't control everything your kids do, but they are a window into your character. And it's a place where you set them up for belonging. So next is church. And all of us are part of churches. Your church is your spiritual family. And you want people to prioritize life in the church. It's the essential place of spiritual identity and formation. And I think being part of a local church is super important. I think we're not ourselves by ourselves, like Eugene Peterson said. I think a lot of the passages we looked at say we don't grow alone, we grow together. And it's important that we as the church bind together and try to grow together. Now, what I recognize here, though, is that I am speaking as a pastor of a church. And most of you are ministry leaders in some form or another. And it's really easy to have this like laity-clergy divide. And it's almost like we're prepared to be on the pedestal or a little bit above. You can't give too much from people. You can't totally let them into your spheres. I almost got that feeling in my training, that I had to be sort of the chief among elders and a little bit outside of everybody's view, like they couldn't know everything about my life. And then I came across this quote that I found to be so helpful from, skip this one, from Paul David Tripp. There's way too much functional anonymity in the pulpits of our church. He writes this in chapter 6 of his book. In this chapter, if anybody here is, any of you seminary students, you have to get the book Dangerous Calling, and you have to read chapter 6. Now, this is good for anybody, but especially for a seminary student training to go into full-time ministry. He talks in this chapter about what happens is a lot of times we send people off to a seminary away from their home, away from their friends, and we create this enclave of friends who are in a very niche part of life with us, the seminary experience. And we all circle up in our friendships around what we're doing in school. And we've all gone to school, that school isn't absolute reality. It's sort of like this alternative universe. And you experience life differently, and then you go out to the working world, and life's very different, your schedule's very different, but you've just spent 3 to 5 years of your life in a certain type of friendship, and now you're supposed to go lead people, and you've sort of forgotten how to develop friends in a circle that's not quite like seminary. And then the second part is people view you as a spiritual leader as, well, he's the pastor, he doesn't have time. People say that to me all the time. I know you're busy, but, like, actually I'm not busy. I have nothing to do. Please hang out with me. But in this chapter of the book, he talks about how this is sort of part of our training, and then we get into our churches, and we're leading, and we're told that we can't be all that vulnerable. And you don't want to tell every secret that you have in the pulpit. That's not what he's talking about here. You should be honest and vulnerable in some of the stories that you tell from preaching. But what he's talking about here in this whole chapter is we have created this category of pastor or spiritual leader who is over here, and everybody else in the church is over here, and you can't be friends with people in your church. He's essentially giving you permission to be friends with people in your church. I had never heard that before. Like, wait, I can be friends with these guys who are elders? I can be friends with these young couples? I don't have to have my guard up all the time. I'm allowed to be vulnerable. Guess what? It's my spiritual family too. My congregation is my spiritual family too. So when they hurt, I hurt. And when I'm going through a hard time, they're praying for me. And we care about each other. I'm not on a pedestal. just because I stand behind a pulpit. And so what he encourages here is view your spiritual family truly as a family. Maybe you're an uncle. Maybe you're a brother. You don't always have to be the grandpa or dad at your church. And let other people speak into your lives, and let other people pray for you, and let other people hear your stories, and listen well to them, and spend quality time with them, not just to counsel them or disciple them, but have fun with people in your church. Love them. That's what you do with family, right? Love them. Don't just ask them to do stuff for the building or for the programs. Love them. And so I thought this was super helpful, looking at your spiritual family. So these are some categories that we have. When we're talking about developing, nurturing life-giving relationships, marriage, family, spiritual family. And maybe some of the friends you have are in your church, and maybe I think it's healthy to have friends outside the church too, because you might get fired, you might get kicked out, your family might choose to move and go somewhere else. It's good to have outside voices. And some of these friendships from college that you maintain, some of these friends from a previous job that you maintain. But these are people, if you understand the idea of friendship, who just share in your griefs and your joys. Someone you know you can call because you've gone through a hard time and they'll listen to you. Someone that you want to give good news because they'll celebrate with you. And these are the kind of people who will encourage you no matter where you're at. I found this to be true for me recently. I was just feeling this like late 30s. My kids are all getting older. I'm starting to wonder, like, who are my actual friends? It's just, I got like church people that I consider friends, and I have seminary people. I looked at my wedding photo. This is what happened. I looked at my wedding photo, and none of the guys who were in that photo have any role in my life right now. And I thought, that's sad. These were my best friends in the world. And I might talk to 2 of them once a year. Do I have any friends? I was having this crisis. So I bought a Miata. And then I read this. There's a plague that sometimes worries me, and it's not one of the great biological plagues that we face today. I care about those, but the plague I think about almost every day is the plague of loneliness among men. I should say men. In truth, the phrase that goes through my mind is this: the plague of the friendless man. This is more, I think, a problem for men than it is women. I think women are a little bit more relational and social than men are. Think about this. The older you get, the harder it is to build friendships. What happens when you're my age in high school is you become friends with parents of people who have kids who are in the same sport or band or extracurricular activity. And guess what? That only lasts for 3 to 6 years. You know what happens to those friendships a lot of times? They disappear. So finding ways to cultivate friendships that last a lifetime. We have a guy in my church, 2 guys in my church that get together every Wednesday for lunch with another friend. And every once in a while I'll see him at Martin's and I'll go over to their table and I'll sit down. Like, I love your friendship. How do you maintain this? They say we put it on the calendar. We just make sure that we see each other every week. And then they do fun things together as families, too. They go camping and stuff. But they make a point to get together regularly. So I have a few colleagues that I get together with regularly who are friends, and we go to events together, or we plan stuff together. It's important to set those things aside. But I had a former pastor of mine who said it's lonely at the top. Have you ever felt that? It's lonely at the top. And it's especially lonely if you don't seek out friendships, and sometimes friendships outside the church. There's one thing up here I say that says Dunbar's number. This is a sociologist from England, and he talks about these different spheres, and you can break them down different ways. But they talk about 150 is about the amount that of names or people that your brain can connect with. So I like being part of a smaller church because I can remember everybody's name, and that's like a circle that fits in my head. But if you really break it down, even in a church like that, you have like a group of 30 that you're really close to. Even within that, he breaks it down in groups of 3. So you have your 150 is about the most your brain can do, but 75 to 50 are like the people that you know a lot more about. And then you break it down to 20 to 12, and those are the people that you're actually close to, regularly talking to. And then he breaks it down farther, and he says 5 to 3 is about the most that you can be regularly intimate with. Dunbar's number. You can do the numbers slightly differently. But if we're to look at our close friendships, it's probably normal to have 5 to 3 really, really close friends. And I'd hope your spouse would be one of those. Outside of that, 20 to 12 people who you would be like part of maybe a small group, or they'd be your closer circle, some in your church, some outside your church, but you could call these people in the middle of the night. They'd help you out. These people would get together with you if you asked them to. Just close friends. And then the bigger groups, you'll work together on stuff. You may not see each other all the time, and so on. They also did a study on Facebook. This was years ago, but Wired Magazine did this. Really interesting, talking about friendships. They were saying, now that we have social media, aren't friendships way better, right? How many friends do you have? I don't have any because I'm not on Facebook. But if I did, I'd probably have hundreds, right? You'd all like me today. I'd be one of your friends. But then they did closer research, analytics on Facebook. And they found that if you closely pay attention to Facebook, and I know they've changed the algorithm recently, that really people have a 6-to-1 ratio. As in, there's really 6 people who are really paying attention to your Facebook feed, who are really tracking, commenting, following. And this lines up with the study that they've done elsewhere, that most people have 6 close friends at most. So Facebook hasn't actually accelerated friendships, it's just made people more accessible. True friendship, the kind of people who are partners in life's griefs, joys, adventures, and daily realities, there's probably 3 to 5, maybe 6 for you. Next we have mentors, and I think I put in your notes also here mentees or apprentices. These would be people that you're pouring into. That's next. A mentor is a sage, an encourager in ministry, family, or personal growth. These people go by different names. Some of you have a spiritual director, and this is a person who coaches you in the spiritual life and asks you to pay attention to what's God doing in your life. And they ask you questions that will direct you toward God. You might have a coach who actually that's what Newt does. He gives you coaching in maybe your preaching or your church leadership. Or you might just have a mentor, an older person in your life who you can go to and bounce questions off of. There is another far more informal version of this that I would say is probably the impersonal one, would be like a really great author that you like to read. So there are people that you like. I love to read Eugene Peterson books. In a way, he's a mentor to me. Now, do I have a personal relationship with him? No, but I love his books, and what he has lived out has taught me a lot. But if you only have impersonal mentors, it probably sets you up for some danger. So you need personal mentors, like that older person that knows you pretty well, and then a focused mentor, like a coach or a spiritual guide can be helpful. Finding those kind of people can be a little bit challenging because I think it can be vulnerable to say, hey, I want to coach. Would you coach me? I think calling someone up and saying, hey, I'd love to get together with you just to talk about life isn't that intimidating, and see where it goes from there. That's what I've tried to do in my time. Here's what MacDonald says. He kind of categorizes people in 5 different groups. He has very resourceful people, very important people. He also has very draining people that you probably know in your lives. Very resourceful people are the kind who make supreme contribution from which we ourselves draw. We study their ways and customize them for ourselves. We lean upon them for direction and approval. We gain energy from their courage and maturity. They are, in every sense of the word, our resource. And from then, we can draw on our first senses of passion. So he says it's really important to find these resourceful people, but not to meet with them so often that you start to depend on them and ape them. I started reading so much Eugene Peterson at one point that I felt like everything I wrote sounded just like Eugene Peterson. That's not what you want from a mentor. You want good advice, sage wisdom, but also room to become yourself too. So looking for these kind of people is really important. Some of you get to become those kind of people as a mentor, and you have mentees then. These would be people who are learning from you. And I love being in this area so close to Grace College. I will often get students who come to our church, and I get to share with them all of my wisdom that I've accrued over the few years. And they actually get to be, here's the best part of being a mentor. They get to, because we meet regularly, speak into my life as a pastor. They get to critique my sermons. They get to give fresh eyes to what we're doing at our church. So I've always viewed mentoring as a both and kind of relationship. I get to learn from them as they get to learn from me. And I learned that back in Phoenix when I called a guy and said, "Can I be your mentor?" And his first comment was, his name was Ed Wake, and he goes, "Yes, I'd love to learn from you. Come out and we'll learn from each other." It was so encouraging to hear an older man say that to me. I want to learn from you. So when I think of mentees, finding that person who is, you've heard the acronym FAITHFUL, available, teachable, someone who is willing to learn, someone who has just a tendency to show up to lots of things, so there's faithfulness that you see in them. But a mentor is a recipient of our wisdom, training, and attention for a time. Okay, I think I skipped colleagues, but these would be people who are doing the same thing as us, showing up to these kind of things, and it's worth sitting around the table and picking their brains and sharing wisdom. You may not become best buds, but it's good to know other people who are in the battle with you, and so that would be the colleagues thing that I skipped. So here's what I want you to do. Flip over your notes to the next page, page 6. And I want to give you 3 minutes to do a soul analysis here. I have all these different spheres that you can look at: your marriage, family, church, friends, colleagues, mentors, and mentees. And I want you to write the names of people whose relationship is most life-giving to you in that sphere. So hopefully for marriage, it's your spouse's name. But then under church, you might list some names or friends. And then really think about what makes the relationship so meaningful. And then the other question is, to whom do you give life? So I want to give you 3 minutes to do that. Everything in between. So I think life is more about establishing rhythm than it is achieving balance. And this is getting to moderating and managing my energy. So figuring out, when do I have the best energy? What can I do to further my energy? And when do I need to take a break? That'll be the next thing we get at. So if you're looking at your handout, what we talk about here first is exercise, stewarding my body for daily focus and long-term effectiveness. This thing here, it's more than a shell, it's my body. I know the world right now wants to say that this is a shell and what's on the inside is all that matters. But I can tell you, what's happening here affects what happens on the inside. Our external self affects what's going on spiritually. And so if I am really, really tired all the time, I have less to give spiritually. If I am really, really weak, I have less to give spiritually. If I'm really, really sick, I have less to give spiritually. Often. Now, God teaches us different things and uses us different ways in times of weakness or tiredness or sickness. I understand that. But I want to be a good steward of my body. So one of the things we look at with exercise is, what sort of exercise patterns do you have? I make it a habit to run 3 to 4 times a week. I love to run. Most of the people I talk to hate running. They think it's torture of some sort. I find it to be freeing. What's important is finding an exercise that you enjoy doing. Find one that you like. You don't like running? Go for a walk in nature. Walking is good for you too. Ride a bicycle, go swimming, but do something that gets your heart rate up a little bit. It's good for you. Now, I know one of the reasons that this is challenging is because when we feel strapped for time, giving time to exercise feels selfish or it feels unnecessary. Here's something I'm able to do because of the freedom I have with my schedule. It may not work for everybody. There's something called temptation bundling. There were some psychologists or economists out of Penn University, and Catherine Milkman is her name. She came up with something called temptation bundling. Has anybody ever heard of temptation bundling? It's taking something that you don't like to do and putting it with something you do like to do, so you get the two, like you get a reward for doing something you don't want to do. So the theory was, we have a lot of people who don't want to go to the gym and walk on the treadmill, but they love to listen to books on tape. So we'll give them access to a book on tape, but only when they're on the treadmill. We'll make it work only that way. And so they found that their exercise increased dramatically because they temptation bundled. They gave a reward for something they didn't like. One of the things that I like to do is listen to podcasts or review my sermon. I also like to jog. I don't like to just sit down and listen to my sermon, though. That's boring. And I don't like to just sit and listen to a podcast because I feel like I could be doing something else. So I always jog while I'm listening to a podcast. I find my mind's pretty fresh when I do that, and I find that I can eke my exercise in so I don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. or work out like when I get home at night. I want to be with my family when I get home. So that's a temptation bundling thing that I've done for exercising. And I make it a plan 3 to 4 times a week that I'm going to run and listen to a podcast. I'm going to walk, listen to an audiobook. It's just a way to reward yourself for exercising. Another thing would be sleep. rhythms, sleep and naps. This is recharging my body for daily focus and long-term help. My wife and I joke that we read a book and became sleep snobs. We read this book by Arianna Huffington last year called The Sleep Revolution. She was at the point of burnout in her life, Arianna Huffington, who runs Huffington Post, where she had been traveling cross-country, and she was sitting down at her desk in between flights and then woke up in a pool of blood because she had worked herself almost to the point of death. And she said, I need to make a change. She started researching sleep. And she realized that if you look at overall health of the body, there are three main factors to health. One is exercise. Two is diet. I've told you I don't fast, so I don't diet. I eat whatever I want. But I do go running, and I like that. But she said the third component to overall health is sleep. And nobody talks about sleep, but people are starting to talk about sleep. There are 4 companies. Do you know this? There are 4 major companies that have sleep pods or sleep stations in their facilities. I'll give you one of them. The Huffington Post does that. Can you think of some of the other ones? Google does. They have sleep pods. And if Google can do it, so should you. Osceola Grace, yeah. That's good. Yeah, that's right. When you're preaching. Has anybody heard of other? A lot of times hospitals will have these too because they want to make sure the doctors are fresh, so they'll have sleeping rooms for the doctors or nurses with big shifts. Now off the top of my head, I didn't write it down, I can't remember, but there were 2 other major companies. I know it was Google, it was Huffington Post, and then 2 other major companies that have invited their workers to take a nap during the workday. I loved this. I decided I'm going to start taking naps more regularly because here's what I notice. At this point in the day, this is always the worst point of the day for all of us. Studies have shown. And I get to this point of the day and I think I should probably study something or read. And as soon as I sit down and open a book, my head is nodding off. And I do this thing where for an hour I will kind of half read because I don't want to fall asleep because that's embarrassing to fall asleep at work. That would be a sin, wouldn't it? So I do this for an hour, and an hour later you say, what did you read? And I was like, I think I'm on the same page. But I didn't fall asleep. So at least I didn't do that. Or you could take a 15-minute power nap. It sometimes takes 6 to 7 minutes for people to fall asleep. And then if you take a 15-minute nap, at most, you'll wake up, you won't be groggy. If you take a little coffee before your nap, if you're a coffee drinker, it'll actually kick in right as you're waking up, and then you'll get that boost. Power nap. There's science behind it. So I've started integrating some napping in my day. I'm just very careful that when I do it, I have a Bible in front of me, and I'm on my knees to make sure it looks like I'm praying. That's if I'm at the church. But I think it's really important to have some sort of sleep pattern and allow yourself occasionally to take a nap. Work it into your schedule and know that time where you're going to pass out. So the other thing that she suggests in this book that my wife and I have started doing, keep phones, tablets out of your bedroom. They don't really help in your bedroom. I know, my alarm's on it. Guess what? You could put your alarm on an alarm clock or on a watch or something like that. But the light from these screens, it makes your eyes think that you're out in daylight, and it does something to your brain to keep you awake. At least that's what some of the science is saying. Also, they suggest turning off all screens, including TV, about a half hour, and dimming the lights about a half hour before you go to bedtime. So my wife loved that. She doesn't allow us to use the bathroom lights anymore because they're really bright. She put Christmas lights around there, so it's really decorative and dim. That's why my teeth are always dirty. I can't... But sleeping and napping, recharging your body for daily focus and long-term help. Take a nap and understand that there's some things that you can do for a bedtime routine that will help you get better sleep. There really are. We do that with children. We should do it with ourselves. Next thing, daily rhythms. This book, When, by Daniel Pink, was great. It was a read about how we have all of these rhythms in life. He says there's so many how-to books, but there are no when-to books. And the when is the missing question. And a lot of success, a lot of strong finishes are related to when things happen. And so he says there's a pattern every day where you start off, and now I know not everybody's a morning person, but he says for the most part, most people wake up with more energy in the morning, and then they hit lunchtime, and they start to drag, and then the time after lunch is especially like, oh, it's kind of zombie time. And then by the time you're getting ready to go home, you get a spark of energy. Some of the best writers and musicians will work for a 4-hour block in the morning, take a lunch and afternoon break, and then they'll work 3 hours into the evening. And that's how they get most of their creative work done. So figuring out what is your daily rhythm. He calls this the peak at the start, the trough in the bottom part, and then also the rebound at the end of the day. Recognize that we all go through that in some form or another. And so planning your schedule around peak and trough and rebound time is really, really important. We'll get more into that in a minute here. But the other thing I recognize when I think of daily rhythms is I have about a 2-hour time limit. So I can sit down and talk with someone, and once I get to that hour and a half time, and it's going to keep going on, I feel like I start to get a glaze over my eyes. And I can't listen to you anymore, and I'm thinking about the next thing. Same thing, if I'm putting together lesson plans for this, if I'm working on a sermon, I know 2 hours is my limit. If I don't get a break or some sort of change of position or change of task after 2 hours, I'm wasting my time. So figuring out what is your breaking point, and then figuring out how to give yourself those changes, pivots, adjustments if it's a 2-hour time limit or a 3-hour time limit for you. So I want to go on to the next one. Here, master calendar. This is putting it all into the bigger perspective. So we've looked at exercise, sleep, naps. These kind of keep our energy up, but we also know that we always go through these modulations. So looking at the master calendar allows us to take full advantage of our time during the week, on the weekends. I know this is something that Newt has talked about in Pastorpedia before that he swears by. I also found this in Eugene Peterson's Contemplative Pastor. He says the master calendar is your best friend. It will allow you to be the most efficient with your time, the most focused on the most important tasks. And he says it keeps you from being busy or lazy, which are actually the same thing. Think about this. He says, by lazily abdicating the essential work of deciding and directing, establishing values and setting goals, other people do it for us. Then we find ourselves frantically at the last minute trying to satisfy half a dozen different demands on our time, none of which is essential to our vocation to stave off the disaster of disappointing someone. And a lot of times we make those decisions in urgent moments because we don't want to disappoint someone, because we're ministry people and we need to be available all the time. Well, you can say, I can't be available right now because I have something else planned. And it could be a date with your spouse. It could be a study time for your sermon. If it's on the calendar, the time is called for. And so you can, in good conscience, say to someone, I actually don't have time for that right now because I have something else scheduled. And it relieves you from feeling like you're lying or you have to jump into their chaos. Here's what happens with unseized time according to Gordon MacDonald in his book, Ordering Your Private World. Unseized time, so if it's not on the master calendar, if you don't know what you're going to do for the day, unseized time flows towards your weakness. So you may not be great at organizing. I got a half hour. I'm going to start organizing. And you're not really organizing. You're just messing around with papers. Unseized time comes under control of dominant people in your world. Oh, that person from the board calls you and they need a report. Oh, yeah. Well, you should have scheduled on your calendar when you were going to write your board reports. I got that on my schedule every month. I know when I'm going to do that, so I don't have to worry about it other times during the month. Unseized time surrenders to the demands of all emergencies. There's a great story in his book here where he says he got a call from someone on a Saturday night. You need to come over. You need to help. My marriage is falling apart. And he said on Saturday nights he is preparing his heart and his mind for a sermon. He's trying to be rested and focused. And she's, but my marriage is falling apart. And he says, well, can I ask you a question? Yeah. How long has it been falling apart? Well, it's been going on for months, for years. Well, if it's been going on for years, I don't need to come over tonight. I have a sermon that I'm going to preach tomorrow, but next week I'll have some time, and then we can talk about your marriage. I thought that was brilliant. Now, in the emergency, the person knows that this is the time it needs. It's been going on for a long time. And if you have that time on the master calendar, you don't give over to that emergency. Finally, unseized time invests in things that gain public acclamation. So if other people are going to see it and praise you for it, you're probably more likely to do it. If you're using a master calendar, it allows you to focus more on what you know you need to do by yourself, in secret. It's a good thing to have. And you don't get praise for that kind of stuff. I'm going to go straight into developing rhythms of work and rest, and then I'm going to give you a chance to look at these two things together because I think they're tied. Developing rhythms of work and rest. This is more broad than managing your time and energy. This is looking at your day, your week, your year together. This is where I would make the statement that the daily devotional time for a Christian shouldn't be sermon prep. You could argue with me on this one, though. I think sermon prep can do something to your heart, but if I'm asking people regularly to spend time in God's Word, they're not doing that at work. They're not doing that when they're getting paid for it. They're doing it because they know that it's the right thing to do. I want to do that myself. Also, if I'm always doing my devotions just to give it to someone else, it's not actually for me. It's really just to regurgitate. I want God to speak to my heart every single day. I want to be available to Him first and foremost. So when I talk about developing rhythms of work and rest, it's finding a routine. I say morning devotions. Some people are night people, but I think morning is the best time to do it. It's before my wife and kids wake up. I have a very specific pattern that I use that's helpful for me because if I don't, I'm distracted. But I'm not going to tell you my pattern because it's mine. You need to develop your own patterns. But I think it's important to set aside some time, at least 20 minutes, for prayer, for journaling, for reading Scripture, at least 20 minutes. I also have a monthly prayer retreat. This is part of my rhythm of work and rest. I want to make sure that I have a set-aside time to think about my ministry, my personal life, and really pray hard about things. If I only pray the little snippets in the morning and then throughout the day, I don't get that focused time to listen to God or to meditate on chunks of Scripture. So for me, having a monthly prayer retreat is really important. What I did was I picked the first Thursday of the month, and I did that for 3 years, and I found that I was skipping every other prayer retreat because Thursday's sermon prep time. So I'd be like, I get my sermon done early, and then I'll pray. And you know how often I got my sermon done early? Every other month. And it always got squeezed out. So one of the shifts I made that was helpful to me was when you put things at the front, they tend to get done. When you put things to the back, they get pushed off. So I thought if I really want to pray, I'm going to do it the first thing in the day, and I'm going to do it the first Monday of the month. It's a lot easier to make sure I have that prayer time if I put it at the front of the month. So that's something I do, and I told you a little bit about that before. Also, annual adventures are pretty important to me. 5 years ago for my birthday, my wife wrote Eugene Peterson and said, my husband's a pastor. He loves serving in the church. He reads your stuff and is always encouraged by it, and I want good things for him. Can he come out and visit you? It was like the coolest thing my wife ever did for me. And I got a letter in the mail 2 weeks before my birthday, and I didn't recognize the handwriting, but it said Montana. I was like, and I always guess my gifts, and it ruins it for the family every time. And I walked in. I wasn't supposed to see the letter. It was actually supposed to go to our neighbors, but Eugene Peterson didn't read the fine note, I guess, and he sent it directly to my home, and I get this letter, and I'm like, Montana. I only knew 2 people from Montana, my aunt and Eugene Peterson, and this doesn't look like my aunt's handwriting. And I'm like, would I have gotten a letter from Eugene Peterson by any reason? And my wife grabs it out of my hand, and she's like, what? You weren't supposed to see that! And it invited me out. He invited me out to his home to spend an afternoon with him, with me and my wife. And she couldn't go, so I took one of my best friends with me. We got to travel across the country. We got to go to Mount Rushmore. It started pouring down rain while we were there. We got some selfies. We had people giving us weird looks. We went to Yellowstone. We got in at 11 o'clock at night. We had nowhere to stay. We pitched a tent in the dark. It was really cold. Then we hiked through Glacier National Park. This is Glacier National Park. And my friend was terrified of a certain hiking point, and I still laugh when I envision his face. It was a really great memory that we built, and I got to spend 4 or 5 hours with Eugene Peterson, which was like a dream for me, just to talk with him and hear stories from him about pastoral ministry. These kind of adventures have to be in our life. Now, that's not possible for all of us every year, but annual camping trips, hiking with guys that you're friends with, going out with ladies to visit a city that you've never visited before. That kind of stuff keeps you recharged. Is there anything super spiritual about some of that stuff? Not necessarily, but it keeps your energy up and it builds bonds with other people, which is part of the soul, right? And so it's really important to make sure when you're looking at your calendar for the year, what sort of adventure do I want to go on this year? How am I going to get away and get away with others for building a good memory? And then the last thing would be recreation. There's all sorts of things that you might do for fun. But I was talking to a pastor about 3 years ago. We're all pastors of churches. We have smaller kids. And he said, you know, guys, I just feel like I'm not having fun anymore. Do you ever feel that way? And I have a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun with my kids. I have a lot of fun with my friends. I try not to take myself too seriously. I think that's really important to not take yourself too seriously. Do you know for the first session, my fly was down the whole time? I don't know if anybody noticed. If you did, you should have told me, because that's embarrassing. I think it's hilarious. That's a divine appointment right there for someone leading a session. Yes. Stuff like that happens to me all the time, and I just laugh. It's a new adventure. I even wondered if I should tell you, but here I am, an open book in front of you all. The thing is, we need to find things every week, maybe every day, that just bring joy to your heart. I've read more fiction in the last 3 years than I've read since I was a kid, because I love stories. And I don't want to just keep reading church books. They bore me. Sometimes I get tired of them. But reading Watership Down, man, that teaches me something about vigilance and leadership. So pick up books like that. Reading the book I read earlier this year, Ready Player One, teaches me about how the people want to view the future. I got to read this kind of stuff because it keeps you alive and vibrant. Playing sports, if you can play sports. Going out to eat, having milkshakes is my favorite thing in the world. That kind of stuff, you have to treat yourself if you're in ministry, because every good gift comes from the Lord. And he has all these little things for us to enjoy and celebrate. So I think we should be the kind of people who really take recreation seriously. So we're going to stop here for a pause. That's a lot of material, but I'm going to give you 2 minutes to look back in your notes over developing rhythms of work and rest, and also managing or moderating my energy. I want you to pick one of those soul analysis questions. Or you can do the chart on page 8. Pick one or two things there. Take 2 minutes, and then we'll hear from 2 people. And then I'll cover the last thing. Wrote down. I realized I skipped family rhythms, so I'm just going to tell you one thing. It's kind of funny. My son that we adopted from Ethiopia, he has special needs. He was mute when he came over here. He speaks a little bit now, but he's cognitively delayed and may never catch up. And one of the hardest things for him to get is the days of the week. And now that we have him in our family, I realize that we are very patterned people in the Sprankle house. We used to have Wednesday date night, me and Liz. We have Sunday movie night where the two of us watch a movie together. Wednesday pizza and a movie night with the kids, or just movie night with the kids. Friday pizza and a movie night with the kids. We watch a lot of movies. Saturday's pancakes. Every Saturday morning we have pancakes. And then Sunday's church. So every night with Sensi we say, do you know what day it is tomorrow? And he goes, school. So Monday, we have 3 days of the week with Sensi. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is all school. And then, do you know what tomorrow is? It's pancakes. Pancakes is now a day of the week at the Sprankle house. So we have school, pancakes, and church. Those are our 3 days of the week in the Sprankle household. Last night, my wife made pancakes for dinner, and it threw my son's world off. He was so confused that he had to go to school tomorrow. But we have lots of family rhythms, and we find that that's been helpful for us to have meals together and certain things that we look forward to. So let me hear from 2 of you, something that you wrote down on rhythms or managing your time or energy. Yeah, Greg.
I began to implement about a year ago, what you said about unseized time, some of those things. And so Monday mornings, I don't even go into the office. My day off is Friday, but Monday mornings, I don't go into the office. I go to a coffee house. And I go to the same one every week, and I work for 4.5 to 5 hours on just mainly my message and get that all outlined and put together as well as I can during that time frame. And then it's ready, and I just mull it over then all week long, and it just can play around in my mind. But I found the same thing for you. I used to try to save that till Thursday, thinking that it's fresh, but the problem was I was cramming it in.
Okay.
So I started doing that. The other thing I started doing is I reassigned some of the role of our church secretary just to me, and said, we share calendars. And so that sounds weird. I share my Google Calendar with her, and she makes my appointments for me. So anytime I need to meet with somebody, she knows when my available times are, and she makes those appointments. And we're not that big of a church, but it has helped me redeem a lot of time and not double book, because I'm horrible at it, so I don't double book anymore. And we sit down every Tuesday morning then and just review all of that stuff for the week. So I know everything that's coming, and for the next 2 weeks really, but we do that for about an hour every Tuesday morning. And those 2 times are locked, and that has helped me fit in all of those other things that have to fit in, and it really makes things a lot simpler.
Being rigid in some areas allows you to be so much freer in other areas.
It does.
Yeah. But one other person, share what you wrote down.
I grew up taking piano lessons, and I stopped because my brother hated it. And I think it wasn't my playing, he just didn't like music, But I got my family piano from my parents, for my kids, and I play it for 15 minutes every day. And just the challenge of a new song or something, and to be able to work at something. I found that ministry is so hard because we never have our work done, and so I just have had to implement things in my life to get things done and feel like I can actually say I did this. And so to work at a new song that just challenges me to. And then I can get it done, and I feel like, hey, I did it, and then I can show it off for people to come over and say, hey, I want to play a song for you. And I don't know what it is about that. So it's more of just a broad, for me, it's just what are things I can do to make me feel like I've done something.
Yeah. I think that's why I like reading so much. I know when a book is finished it. I know a pastor who loves to garden because he's like, I don't know what I'm doing with ministry, but when these plants grow up and we chop them off, I know what the productivity has been. Let's do the last set here. I'm going to race through this. Can I do this last set? Okay. This will be participatory as well. This is just maintaining a learner's posture. The fact that you're here means that you're a learner. I just wanted to share 5 podcasts that I love. I love Freakonomics Radio. They do really intriguing studies on the hidden side of everything. TED Radio Hour. This is a compilation of TED Talks where they talk about entertainment, technology, some science stuff. It's really, really interesting. I listen to the Andy Stanley and Craig Rochelle and Newt Larson podcast. Those are my 3. Do you have one yet? Christian Leadership Podcast is a really good one, too. They get a lot of great Christian leaders that they interview about different topics. And then Think Biblically is Biola's podcast. They talk through lots of tense cultural topics and encourage us to think biblically. I think podcasts are great if you can do them while you're biking, running, driving. It's a great time to listen. Maintaining a learner's posture means I challenge myself regularly with a theological topic that's a little bit outside my comfort zone. So I'm currently reading Salvation by Allegiance Alone, which is looking at Paul's writings from a slightly different angle. And it's been a really, really popular book that someone pointed me to, but I thought it was Salvation by Grace Alone. So I want to read that and think through that topic. And then Why People Matter. It's a book on social anthropology versus biblical anthropology, what makes a human. So I try to pick a couple books each year that will stretch me theologically instead of just reading, self-help or church leadership books. I love to come to training events. Pastorpedia is at the top of the list there. Can I hear a plug for Pastorpedia? Yeah. Heartland Network is a local group of guys that I get together with. A learner's posture isn't about a place you go or something you listen to, but it's also people you're with. And you can have a learner's posture being with other believers who are in the same field. I've learned so much from other pastors in the area. And Access Conference is a conference that my fellowship does every year. ETS is the Evangelical Theological Society. They do this annual event around the country, but then they do a regional one. I always go with Lee and buy books for super cheap and listen to really nerdy papers, and my mind goes, but it's good for me. It's good to stretch yourself beyond what's comfortable in your thinking. And then I think it's really important as Christian leaders to have a reading plan. And so for me, what I try to do each year is have a reading plan, so I don't just finish a book and think, what do I read next? But categorically, I have several things that I know I want to touch on every year. So every year I read a prayer book because it's my weakest spiritual discipline and I want to get better at it. I read a leadership book or a church book every year because that's what I'm doing and I want to get better at it. So it helps me fine-tune my vision. Every year I read some sort of discipleship book because I think not just leading with vision casting, but I also want to figure out what do I do with small groups and one-on-one with people. So these are books that are part of my vocation. A contemporary theological issue, I already mentioned that because I want to stretch my theological thinking and not get caught up in what I studied 20 years ago. And then a spiritual formation book, which is usually more comprehensive or a spiritual disciplines book. It's more comprehensive than just prayer, but I want to cultivate my soul and always look for a new way to do Bible reading, prayer, fasting, solitude, those kind of things. So I make a plan every year to read at least one or two books in each of these categories, in addition to stuff I try to read for fun, because it's important to make sure I have a well-rounded reading plan. And I think it would be for you. So here's what I want to do for an interactive. Just give us 5 of you, and I know, Jordan, you said you had one. So Jordan's going to give us one. Could 4 of you give us one book that you think everybody in this room should read? So what was yours? You told me earlier.
It's Under the Unpredictable Planet by Eugene Peterson.
Planet?
Plant.
Okay. Oh, okay. Jonah.
It's using Jonah as a parable for vocational ministry.
So write these down. Just tuck them away, and whenever you sit down and develop your reading plan, you might pick up one of these 5 books if you haven't read it already. Under the Unpredictable Plant by Eugene Peterson. I hear 4 more from all of us because we can learn from each other and what books have inspired us or challenged us.
Well, along the same lines of today's topic, a book by Robert Saucy called Mind the Heart. And it would be kind of his take on the same issues like Dallas Willard on renovation of the heart.
Saucey.
No, it's Saucy.
Mind and heart.
Mind the Heart.
Mansfield's Book of Manly Men.
Oh, that's fun. Probably more for the men in the room than the women.
Probably.
So can I hear from one of the ladies? What's a book that it doesn't have to be a book geared toward women, but what's something that you think we should read?
Killing Kryptonite.
Say it again.
Killing Kryptonite by John Bevere.
By John
Bevere.
Bevere. Bevere. One more.
Okay, my husband and I are enjoying reading Design to Lead.
Okay. Design to Lead. Can you remember the authors' names? It's a newer one by B&H. For anyone who's interested, all the stuff that I did in research for this, I have a bibliography that's annotated, so it gives you a sentence or two about the value of the book. There's also a digital copy that you would have access to up here if you don't want paper. But I love to read, and it's one of the greatest ways to learn. So I printed off 10 of these. So this is my top 5 list here. I'll put these on this corner. And I believe that the last thing it says in your notes is testing my limits. And I deliberately left that blank because who knows what's next for any of us. But I think it's good to know your limits, but God also to strengthen your soul. He wants you to test your limits too. And I'm up with my time limit, so I'm going to stop.